So Mississippi has actually done something very unique. They doubled down on making certain that the state had resources, identified what the gaps were, and invested in those gaps. And because of that, the state of Mississippi has seen a literacy turnaround. And so, from that standpoint, it wasn't should the government intervene, it was how much should the government intervene.
The main episode is built around the learning signal gap. The distance between what the education system signals a student has learned and what the student can actually demonstrate. But once you move into politics, there's another problem underneath it. We're calling it the control outcome disconnect. That is what happens when we keep changing who controls education without proving that changing control actually changes what kids learn. Washington controls some of the funding, enforcement, and protections. States control policy. Districts and schools control much of what happens in the classroom. And families are increasingly being given more control through school choice. But here's the question underneath all of it. When control moves, do the outcomes move with it? Because if they do not, we have not solved the learning signal gap. We've just moved the lever.
And so we make the pivot to politics. And in order for certain things to happen in a classroom, in order for there not to be individuals carrying guns to class, there has to be a federal government that says this is what, from a federal standpoint, this is what is going to be allowed with respect to the educative society, and this is what we're going to ban. These are the things that every state must provide for a student. What we've seen over the past 2 years or year and a half is a dismantling of the Department of Education, which is the first receipt in terms of politics. And that's impacting everything from Title I to IDEA to civil rights enforcement, as well as educational data and accountability. And they're pushing it down to the states to be able to, or for the states to implement guidelines in terms of what should happen within those state confines. And that's fine to a certain degree. But the reason that there was the development of a Department of Education was because what Lynn chose to cover in Texas and what John chose to cover in Georgia, there had to be some type of federal mandate that there were going to not be so polar opposite that the kid was going to graduate and not be able to speak a common language. And so, from that standpoint, what we've seen over the last 18 months is a dismantling of some of those guardrails that have been put in place that would allow every student to get a quality education, to be able to understand basic history, to be able to understand basic facts with respect to education, and to be able to hopefully get a job that will allow him or her to make a decent wage in terms of their avocation in life. And so the question that I have for you with respect to policy, Washington, and Department of Education, and the disbandment of the Department of Education is if Washington, and to be clear, I don't believe that Washington, D.C. should decide everything with respect to curriculum. I do believe there has to be national standards. And so the question for you is this: if Washington doesn't choose the curriculum, then hire the teachers or run the schools, what problem with kids actually learning gets solved by the dismantling of the education?
Okay, so from my understanding, the Department of Education, it does administer the programs, distributes the funding, enforces the federal education laws and civil rights protections. It collects that national data and supports research and evidence-based practice, but it never was responsible for selecting the curriculum, the standards, the staffing, the instruction, the school operations. That was never part of the Department of Education, from my understanding. The bigger problem is to make sure that, and what could be lost is that historically underserved students don't lose the federal infrastructure that was designed to identify disparities, enforce protections, and target resources. That's the problem. It's not the fact that of what they're learning, it's protecting those underserved or historically underserved communities and making sure they have what they need.
But here's the problem with that. And yes, I sort of framed it poorly, but the question essentially is we don't need Washington to establish the curriculum. We don't need Washington to establish the tenets in terms of hiring teachers. We don't
Mhm.
need Washington to be able to run the schools. That said, there are certain things that we do need DC to put in place. And you just spoke about one of them, and that was making certain that a certain student could get the benefit of getting a quality education. That was the problem. That if you were black or brown in some parts of this country, you were going to schools that were subpar and you weren't getting quality education. You weren't getting quality curriculum. You weren't getting qualified teaching. And so Washington needed to step in and say there's a minimum threshold in terms of what it has to be provided at the state level for Lynn to be able to get a quality education. This teacher has to have X number of years with respect to education or a teaching certificate or a pathway to get a teaching certificate. The school must have X, Y, and Z. The school must have resources for not only kids who are on grade level, but kids with special needs, kids who are low income, or kids who are, in need of whatever, whatever, whatever. And that school, if you are educating them over the course of the day. And so, from that standpoint, when you have an administration going, we're not going to do any of that, we're going to leave all that to the state, that does you as a taxpayer a disservice, because you can have states like Mississippi, states like Florida, Tennessee, states like Arkansas, who typically are going to be on the lower end in terms of test scores, decide that they're going to offer less than a state like Vermont or Maine or Massachusetts or California.
A couple of things, and let's talk about Mississippi in a minute. For me, the dismantling of the Department of Education is personal, right? Because the Department of Education enforces IDEA, it enforces the OCR, the Office for Civil Rights, and the Free Appropriate Public Education. So those things are important, obviously, to me. Even though my son has exited out of K-12, those are still things that are important. Even when you look at certain universities, that they have to make accommodations for students that learn differently. So that's something that fell under or falls under the Department of Education, so it's close to me. And I think that's the biggest issue, is that those protections, although they're probably moved to different departments, there's not one department that's focused on that. And that's my concern.
Yeah, the problem is right now it's spread all over the place.
Right.
You have some at HSS, and you have some with labor. And so you have a lot of the roles that used to belong to the Department of Education now, ferreted out to other individuals.
And so not only that, but it was already a challenge getting resources or information from one department, and now that it's dispersed across multiple departments with people that don't have the specialization, it makes it even more challenging. That's
Well,
the problem I have.
and so that leads to receipt number two, school choice. As an individual who's been in the education space for almost 2 decades, I am a huge advocate for public schools. I'm not a fan of charter schools generally. I'm not a fan of school choice generally. One of the reasons is because we look at data, and I'm a big data guy. When we look at the data doesn't show. If I would give Lynn a voucher, and Lynn then uses that voucher to go to a private school or whatever, I have not seen where those schools year over year perform better than public schools. That is the problem that I'm having. And so it's not about whether or not these schools, in my opinion, it's not about whether Lynn Elementary School is going to do better in terms of test scores. Is Lynn Elementary School is going to have Lynn controlling what happens in the school. And it's all about authority. Second example I will use. Story came out in the Wall Street Journal today or yesterday about Mark Zuckerberg's wife, Jane Zuckerberg, and how she'd made this huge pledge of 125 million over 10 years, I think, to fund this public school or this public charter school, to put things into this public charter school so that these kiddos would be able to have a quality education. Well, she just announced that she is no longer going to be funding this school that she pledged to fund. Why? Because their test scores weren't as high as she thought they should be. And I'm like, okay, but what you're learning now is not about throwing more money at the problem. It's about making certain that you're hiring quality individuals, you're giving them the resources that they need in order to be successful. And so the issue that I have is with school choice is you have a lot of individuals who are not educators who believe that they should be able to run a school like a business. That's the problem that I'm having. And it's something that irks me to my core. As a former teacher, everyone believes that they can teach. When you have the average freaking parent who can't even teach their own kids. And so imagine if you can't even handle Jim Bob, Becky Lou, and Lynn, who's with you maybe 6 hours a day. Imagine having, 20 of those and being able to then educate them over the course of a school year. Anyway, that's my soapbox issue. But the question I have for you is this. If we're going to spend public money giving families alternatives to public schools, shouldn't or should the first question be whether or not those alternatives actually produce better educated kids?
You are adorable in a not really way. It's like you don't even listen to me. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and back this up. I'm pro private school, but I'm not dis public school. I believe that children or families should have the ability to choose an education environment that works for their children. And obviously, it worked for us. It wasn't about me trying to control the school because I'll try and control everything. That's just been my nature. It's the quality. Quality should matter more than the label. And for you to talk about, well, the public schools, they have these qualified teachers. No, they don't, John. There are states that allow people to go in and teach with just a teaching certification or certificate. They didn't go to school to become a teacher. They went to school to become an officer in the army, and now they're teaching school. Or they became, I don't know what they were, and now they teach school. So there's plenty of states like that because there's a shortage of teachers. So that's a ridiculous statement to make. The other thing that I was going to say is it's not always about saying that you're going to get a better education or produce better results. It's not always about that. And I understand because you're a capitalist that it's always about the output, like what kind of money am I going to make? What kind of student am I going to have? What kind of whatever? Are you going to become a doctor or a lawyer? Like everything revolves around money and how much money somebody. I understand that from your perspective. I get that. But sometimes it's about what that child needs, whether it's a social emotional learning environment, whether it's a religious mission, whatever it is. If it needs to be specialized for your kid, that's one of the things I love about Austin. And I've always said that no matter where your kid is and who your kid is, you can always find an education setting for them that's going to work for them. My youngest one went to this Lutheran school, and all they did was produce doctors and lawyers. That's it. The little is artsy fartsy. Like he's going to become a director. He's going to work in film. And that being a doctor, lawyer wasn't his jam. But he's a very creative, very artistic person that sees the world different than a doctor or a lawyer. Nothing's wrong with a doctor or a lawyer, but that wasn't his journey. So we found a school that connected with him. Now, being a daughter of a Marine, I had gone to several different schools. I went to 4 different high schools. So it was fine for me as his needs changed for me to change environments. I think he probably went to 6 different schools. It doesn't matter to me. I was always going to connect his needs with the environment. It wasn't about the fact that now he's going to come out of school making $200,000 and that's going to show the value of this student and the school. That wasn't the important thing to me. The important thing to me is that he had an education in an environment that was supportive, that was going to allow him to be himself and allow him to grow. And relate that back to a student that goes to a HBCU. An HBCU, one of the things that I heard about that is that it's a safer environment, and it's going to allow you to focus on the education and not the other things. So me putting my son into a school that focused on the things that I felt he needed without all of the other expectations to become a doctor and lawyer, which again wasn't his journey, it allowed him to grow into the person that he is now. And I think that anybody looking for, whether it's a elementary school, middle school, high school, or college, they're going to need to find the environment that's going to allow them to be the best version of themselves. So I could have said for you, you're going to these private HBCUs. Why didn't you go to public? Why didn't you go to South Carolina State?
Okay, so there's a huge difference between where it is and how it is that one matriculates to college versus the resources.
Oh, okay, because it's Howard John.
No, because it's college versus K 12.
Oh, okay. So college, you still have to be in an environment that's going to support you. So why didn't you go to
So then your
a
argument
public
is
school?
this. I because this is the argument that you will have some segregationists make. that I
Okay.
want my kids. Seriously, this was the
Okay.
segregation.
Okay, John.
Literally, this was the
Here,
segregation.
wait, let me do this. This is for my best friend. Sure, John.
Okay, so the argument was my kids would learn better if they are around individuals who think like them, look like them, and make them feel more comfortable, and that I am more comfortable with them being around. And
Okay,
so from
so
that
how is
standpoint,
that different than going to an HBCU?
that's the difference between a K-12 institution.
Help me to understand the difference. It doesn't matter if it's K-12 or if it's college. So
It
help me
is
to
a
understand the
huge difference
difference. Okay,
because
what is it?
you as a tax-paying citizen, you have the right to go wherever you want to go with respect to higher ed. You also have the right to put your kid in whatever environment, K-12 wise, you want to put them in. The problem is when you do that and then you take those resources away from the community, that impacts others in the community. When I decide to go to Howard University for my undergraduate degree, that's not impacting my community.
So I'm supposed to give my kid an environment, put him in an environment that's going to not allow him to be the best version of himself, just because it's going to help your child that you chose to put in public school. I still have to pay my taxes on my house in Texas.
Yeah,
All the
but you're taking
property
it
tax go. It
hold
doesn't
on.
matter where my kid goes to school. I'm still paying property tax and it's still supporting that local school. It's
Okay,
not like
so
I can take my property tax dollars and say I want to allocate it to this private school.
actually you
It
can.
still go. Not in
Actually,
the state of Texas, kind sir.
with
Not in the
school
state of
choice,
Texas.
you do have the right to
I
take
have the right to take my property tax dollars in
your
the state of
tax
Texas where
dollars.
we don't have state taxes and I can allocate it elsewhere.
Okay.
Sure,
That
John.
is the definition of school choice.
Okay, well, I'm going to look that up because I do not believe you and I don't think you know the state of Texas,
Okay.
kind sir.
Well, okay. If you are taking your resources and you are then putting your student or your child in a private school by taking public funds, then you are harming, in my opinion, your community.
So again, so your child is more important than my child. You're saying the collective is more important, socialist, than the individual. That's so
I'm
interesting to
saying
me.
I'm saying that if John decides that he wants to send his kid to a private school, then I have to then fund for that private school. My public school dollars, tax dollars that I paid for, should still go to public education. I would just pay more with respect to sending my kid to a private school.
You are, if I hear you correctly, you are aligning with a socialist viewpoint that the collective is more important. Supporting the collective is more important than the individual.
With respect to education, yes.
Oh, okay. So you can just go ahead and segment your socialism. Got it.
I'm saying that in terms of education, defense, health, public infrastructure, there's certain things for the common good that we need to be able to fund to make certain that we have a viable society.
Either you're going to be a socialist or you're going to be a capitalist. You're not going to be just flip flopping and being fluid in your politicalness.
Literally, that is what. Okay, anyway. So that being said, let's, because we're not going to agree on this, because you sound like, because he's made the
Joe,
same argument today. You're a wonderful teacher who is from Kentucky, who I'm sure is going to be all commenting on this particular episode because he's making the same argument that you just made with
maybe
respect
the state of Kentucky and the state of Tennessee are producing some mighty fine teachers. I don't know, John. Move on.
So Mississippi has actually done something very unique. They doubled down on making certain that the state had resources, identified what the gaps were, and invested in those gaps. And because of that, the state of Mississippi has seen a literacy turnaround. And so, from that standpoint, it wasn't should the government intervene, it was how much should the government intervene. And Mississippi was a huge intervention in terms of public education. And so the question that I have for you, because this raises a fundamental question. If Mississippi can change policy and get different results for its kids, how much patience should we afford to states like Arkansas or Texas who just throws money at the problem but doesn't have a clear direction in terms of what it is and how it is that they're trying to get the results?
None. We should have absolutely no patience for them because Mississippi didn't fix it with their reading problem with one policy. They changed their system. It wasn't just that they adapted letters. They took a multifaceted approach to looking at the problem. So they had higher teacher expectations, which goes back to what I was talking about with the opportunity myth. They trained their teachers, they coached their teachers, they looked at the curriculum, they identified reading intervention earlier. They had accountability and they had the resources. So it wasn't just one thing, it was a system thing, but they were very intentional about doing it. So I don't think that we should give any leeway or grace or space to any state that is not taking the taxpayer dollars and looking at how they can improve the reading outcomes for every single student. And that's going to be hard work because it didn't happen in Mississippi overnight. And Mississippi did not wait for the Department of Education. They did not wait for DC to fix anything. They were like, you know what? There's an opportunity here. We're going to do the hard work and then we're going to make some inroads. But I will also say that Mississippi has some challenges.
That's why you had wonderful Nina Simone said Mississippi damn. Well, yeah, technically she said Mississippi goddamn. And
John, focus.
that song, in terms of Mississippi goddamn, was about Mississippi and some of their backwards way of thinking. Obviously, the state of Mississippi has huge problems going on today with respect to Nolan Wells and that whole shit show in terms of his death, with hanging with talking about students and students making, terrible decisions and students lying and their parents coming up for them for lying. So now hopefully you have justice coming to the Wells family with respect to the loss of life of their young one, and to the parents who have been lying about what it is that their kids knew and what happened to that young man. Shame on you. And I hope the full weight of the justice system comes down as hard as possible on you. That said,
that just because you can read doesn't mean you're a good person. We're talking
yes,
about with the inroads that Mississippi did in reading, but that still doesn't mean that they don't have a cultural, racial, any other type of problem. They still have that. They're still there, and I'm still
yes,
not trying to fly to Mississippi.
yeah. I mean, you should. Ocean
I
Spray.
won't be going there. There's a
I'm saying
whole
Ocean, and I'm
in the 50 states, there's probably like 5 that I want to go to. And there are plenty of them that, you know what, if we ever did have a division in the United States, I can give them to you. You can have them. Bye.
I will say I've had.
Georgia's one of them. Bye. Get out of here.
The sad part is Ocean Springs, which is where this unfortunate incident happened with young men Wells, is a great resort town, beautiful beaches, and it's probably the one of the most prominent areas of Mississippi because it's in that Gulf Coast and it's not too far from New Orleans. And so I spent quality time in Ocean Springs, spent a lot of time in Biloxi, which is another great city, and spent a lot of time in Starkville, which is where Mississippi State is. And there are good people there. But at the same time, you're right. There are some challenges that the state of Mississippi has that they need to get a handle on. So what's the point? Lynn and I can argue all day about public schools, private schools, vouchers, school choice, and how much authority Washington ought to have. And apparently we can. But none of that answers the question that started this entire episode. Are the kids actually learning? That's why the mechanism in the politics conversation matters. We call it the control outcome disconnect. It's what happens when we spend more time fighting over who gets control of education and less time measuring whether or not the changing that control actually produces is a better educational outcome. Because control by itself is not an outcome. Giving Washington more authority doesn't automatically make a child read better. Giving a state more authority doesn't automatically make a child read better. And giving parents more choice doesn't automatically make a child read better. At some particular point, protecting the public school system doesn't automatically make a child read better either. But at some point, someone has to connect the lever to the result. And that's why Mississippi may actually be the most important receipt in this entire conversation. They didn't just change who was in charge, they changed what the system was doing. They raised better teaching expectations, they trained and coached teachers, they looked at curriculum, they identified reading problems earlier. They built accountability into the process and they put resources behind it. In Lynn's words, it wasn't one thing, it was a system thing. And that's the distinction. Mississippi didn't just simply move control, they connected control to an outcome. And that's how the politics conversation comes back to the learning signal gap. If the grade says the kid is doing fine, if the promotion said the kid is ready, if the diploma said the kid has been educated, but the learning isn't there, then the signal still doesn't mean what we think it means. So over the next 30 days, here's what I want you to watch in your own state. When politicians start talking about education, don't just listen for who they're giving power to. Listen for what happens next. What are they changing? What are they measuring? What outcome are they promising? And most importantly, how will we know whether it would work. Because if the control changes but the learning doesn't, that's not reform. That's just a control outcome disconnect in action. And if you haven't watched the main episode of The Learning Signal Gap, go watch that next. Because culture, politics, and edutainment are all attacking the same question from different directions. Are our kids actually learning? And if you know something about raising kids, teaching kids, hiring young people, or making decisions about whether or not your tax dollars go to the right things, then send comments, like it, hype it, subscribe, and then pay attention to what happens after the policy announcement. Because the lever isn't the result, the learning is. Or yeah, about this week. Make the time to do something nice for yourself. And while you're at it, take the time to do something nice for someone else. Until next time, we'll talk to you.
And that's a wrap. Thank you for listening and spending your time with us on I Take Your Point. For more unfiltered conversations like this, click the link in the description. Huge thank you to our production team. We couldn't do this without you. Quick disclaimer, the views shared are those of the host and guests and are for informational purposes only, not professional advice. Keep building your own table, take care, and be well.